Importantly, I mean, there is a tradition of thinking about freedom as sort of like freedom from constraints. To be free would be like to be independent, as it were. That's precisely the model of freedom that I'm arguing against. I don't think it's even an intelligible idea of freedom. Now, the reason why we are essentially free, spiritual freedom in my sense, is that, you know, from a first-person standpoint, there's always a question, irreducibly, of what you ought to do, what you ought to believe, who you ought to be. That question can't go away as long as you're an agent, you know? And it's capacity to engage that question that makes us free. But that sort of freedom doesn't make us independent of others. It makes us essentially dependent on others because, like, I always have to give some practical answer to that question, engage in activities. But whether I am actually who I'm trying to be depends on the recognition of others. You know, what those questions are comes from my social historical situation. But very importantly, this is trying to think together, both that we are like necessarily always like thrown into a social and historical world that precedes us, that we didn't invent. You know, I didn't decide, you know, someone called me Martin, I was thrown into the world, someone took care of me, and that constrained me before I could decide anything about it. You know, but that constraint can't fully determine what I'm doing because I always have to take up those constraints, and there's always a question for me of what I ought to do and who I ought to be. And it's the capacity to engage that question that makes us free. And then there's a question about, okay, which social and historical conditions would allow us, both individually and collectively, to more fully own our responsibility for our answers to that question and our responsibility to engage that question. And that's then the sort of historical progression of freedom. Look at, I mean, part of the point of coining the term of art, socially available free time, which after all is my invention for better or worse, was precisely to shake people out of the assumption that they know what free time means. But what tends to happen instead is that people just drop the socially available and just paraphrase me as talking about free time, and then it's leisure time, and you're totally lost. Like, that's the problem. I mean, because the socially available is extremely important, because that's supposed to like remind us that like the form in which we can live out our freedom is always socially and institutionally constituted, you know, so that like for us to more fully actualize our freedom has to do with how we're socially habituated in the first place and how we are socially formed to engage that question, because there is a dimension of freedom always, like whatever you're doing, you know, what you're doing, there's always a why, a sense of why you're doing it. Like, we can't, there's no sense in which we're free. Whatever you're doing, you can always ask the question why you're doing it, and you can say like, well, because. And you can say like, well, because I have to make a living, because it's profitable. The point is that those are not very good reasons, you know. And for us to have better reason, we would have to have different social institutional forms in which we come to give answers to those questions. And our time would be more free the better reasons there were for it, you know. It's like, oh, because it is for this common social good that I recognize, or because X, Y, and Z, this is meaningful to do, because I'm committed to, even though it's hard, and even though I have to get up early in the morning, you know, then I'm more free because I can actually own the reasons for why I'm doing what I'm doing. And part of the point is, so that's all of that is baked into the socially available. It has to do with the justificatory, the institutional, social, all of those things, and that's actually. And that would be true. That's actually true even when you're eating that pizza and watching that movie. The qualitative experience of that is that, like, whether you're like, you know, why are you doing this, Anthony? Why are you kicking back tonight? And it's just like, because, you know, because I'm tired, because I couldn't think of anything better to do. That's qualitatively impairs that experience compared to the moments when you can ask, you know, like, oh, because I have really made time to relax tonight in view of like the overall rhythms of my life and the way I sort of live out my commitments. It can make perfect sense, and it could be affirmed as a free activity. But we all know that you can also feel like horribly sort of like unfree, deeply sunk into that couch, you know, even though you technically have leisure time. And that has to do with, because like when you ask yourself, like, why are you doing this, Martin? Like, because I don't know. Because is the weakest form of reason. But it shows that like the reason is always a question for us. We can't just say like, even when we would say like, oh, forget about the reason thing, it's so demanding. Like, forget about reason. You can't, and it's betrayed by just this phrase, because. You have to answer somehow. And it's just because. But that's a low degree of freedom compared to like, because I want to make time to spend this evening with Alisa in our relationship and we're like eating pizza. That's a much better reason than like just because I've forgotten even what I'm doing with my life and I can't make sense of it anymore. Yeah.
Well, as you can all see, Martin is really only getting going at this point. Sadly, we have to call a halt at this part of the evening. But as I said at the beginning, Martin will be outside. He'll be signing books. He'll be willing to chat. He'll be willing to. You are free to ask him even more questions, and you are also free to drink our free wine and beverages, etc. Paid for by capitalism at some level, but there you go. But yes, thank you all for coming out. Thank you also to Yulin and Natalie. And thank you also to External Engagement for helping to fund this, and to the University of York. And thank you all for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed the evening.